here we are. This is Sex Love Psychedelics, and I'm your host, Dr. Kat, bringing you psychosexual conversations that will leave you intellectually turned on and hungry for more.
I overhear very prominent leaders in the fields of self-development or men's work, or even women's work, tantra, really everywhere, about these traditional roles, very heteronormative, cisgender heteronormative expectations. And it's interesting to me to see their cult following and how much anger, how much rigidity is formed as a result of this. And it just gets me thinking, like, how much of this is contributing to toxicity. So I'd be curious what your viewpoint, like, how do you view gender roles, models, expectations, and how do you teach that with the men that you work with? For example, I personally, over the years of being in academia, I've really cultivated a perspective around sex and gender through more of the queer lens, the queer theory, meaning really dismantling the traditional assumptions of gender and sexuality to allow for space for authentic expression of an individual. That's not for everybody, and that's okay. But I would be curious what that looks like for you.
Yeah, I appreciate you asking this question. The first thing I'd like to just kind of speak about, I suppose, with clients and with people in general, I suppose, anyone who listen to me really, is like normativity, right? Because we've got, heteronormativity, which is this kind of assumption or this expectation that people are heterosexual. There's beyond that, like mononormativity, this idea that people should be in monogamous relationships, and that's really heavily pushed by a lot of men's coaches, especially. Like even beyond that as well, like, I'm not a gay man, but I've, read about like homonormativity, like this idea that like there's this expected way that you should be gay, or that you should be homosexual, or that you should be lesbian, or that you should be queer. Like there's an acceptable way that you should be queer, and anything beyond that is not acceptable. So there is like, there is rigidity there. Like I really love that word, because that's exactly what it is. It's this is the box, and if you don't fit in the box, then there's either something wrong with you, or you'll get ostracized, or you're a deviant, or whatever it might be. And so typically that's where I start with the guys, is like unpacking their stories about like what it means for them to be a man, what masculinity means to them, what it means for them to be a sexual man as well, or a man in a relationship, like all these stories. And the reason I do that, I should say, is because I did a lot of that when I was in my late teens, early 20s. I went and saw a psychologist. They were trained in narrative therapy. And so I did a lot of unpacking of my stories around like how I showed up in the world, and like where I got these beliefs from, and what narratives I was running in my life, and just essentially unpacking those and rewriting them. And that's kind of what I do with my male clients. And I should say I work predominantly with straight dudes. Like beyond that as well, like, so polarity coaches, I cannot stand. That's maybe a little bit harsh, but like I get polarity. And I really had a great conversation with a friend of mine. His name's Tully O'Connor. I don't mind shouting him out. He talks about like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but with regards to like quote unquote polarity.
So when you're saying polarity, can you define where you're coming from? Because I know there's many different styles of polarity.
Yes, the overarching way that I'll just like define polarity is just like people talking about masculinity and femininity, or being in your masculine energy, being in your feminine energy, and that being a requirement for a healthy monogamous relationship, is one person in their masculine, another person in the feminine, whatever that means. It's usually very dogmatic. It's usually very restrictive. It's usually very regressive as well. But I can get to that. But he talks about how, and I really resonate with this idea of like all these needs need to be met down the bottom of this, pyramid, or this hierarchy of needs. If people are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's like a triangle where at the top is self-actualization at the pinnacle, but underneath all that, to get to self-actualization, there's like food and water and shelter and all these like things that we need to survive, really, before we can start to thrive in that self-actualization space. And I feel like a lot of quote unquote polarity cultures are talking about like playing around with energies and masculine and feminine and all these like dynamics that they, which there is something to, I will say, like exploring masculinity, exploring femininity, exploring energetic play with your partner. But all that is right at the top of the pyramid, in my opinion. There's so many things that need to be met underneath that to build a strong foundation for you guys to play in that energetic space. Like something that really irks me, I'm a new dad, and like I said before, I've got an 18-month-old, and I've been told personally by colleagues of mine who are quote unquote polarity coaches, that the reason why my partner and I aren't having as much sex is because I'm not in my masculine enough. And I wanted to slap him, because because
Will Smith style. No.
and he didn't have kids as well. And I was like, how can you say something like that when you have no experience of like a breastfeeding partner, or a partner who's just undergone a cesarean section and her body's recovering, or sleep deprivation, or a baby with colic, or all these other things that, again, are the needs that need to be met before I use me as a personal example, before I start to quote unquote try and be more in my masculine. How about I try and find a babysitter first, so that my partner and I literally have time to spend together and be intimate and focus on her not being so touched out by our son, so that we can focus. It was just like, there were so many other things. I was like, mate, you have no fucking idea what you're talking about with regards to like giving me advice right now. Like maybe I got a bit defensive because I was, those old stories of like, oh, I'm a guy, I should be having more sex, I should be more sexual. Maybe those stories were kind of rearing their ugly heads, even though I've done a bit of work on them. But it definitely was just like a wake-up call for me that there was all this stuff that polarity coaches and people that talk about masculinity and femininity all the time aren't taking into consideration. And so that's why I'm like quite passionate, and I feel a bit of charge when I speak about it, because I think like it's not they're entirely wrong. It's a yes and, right? It's like yes, we can talk about masculinity and femininity and polarity and energy and things like that. And there's all this other stuff that really needs to be taken into consideration. And my argument is that other stuff is probably more important and needs to happen first before you get to the energy side of things.
Well, that was fun. Thanks for tuning in, lovers. And if you want to experience more ecstasy and sexual liberation, head over to sexlovepsychedelics.com and learn about how you can join me for any one of my online or live events. And while you're there, grab my free guide on sex and psychedelics. Remember, this podcast is for entertainment and educational purposes only. Please contact your healthcare provider and local law before pursuing any of the products or psychedelics discussed. And one final note here. I make this show specifically for you. If you're loving the show, then be sure to leave me a review in iTunes or Spotify to let me know. Happy to be here and happy to serve. I'll see you next time on Sex Love Psychedelics.